Okay, this is a video about the question of whether the FRG was the most stable regime in Germany between 1871 and 1963, and also how you would go about approaching an essay on that question. Now, the first thing to understand is what we mean by stability. What does the word actually mean? Well, we're talking about stability in terms of a number of different possible themes. So we mean political stability. How secure was the government? How stable was it in power? Second issue would be levels of opposition. How much opposition did each regime have? How did it deal with opposition? Did it deal with it effectively? A third theme would be economic stability. How stable was the economy? What problems did it have? How easily were those problems overcome by the different regimes? And was the economy growing, or was it constantly undergoing difficulties? A fourth possible theme could be social stability. So we're talking about things like youth and education, the social classes, relationship between them, religion, different religious groups, women and the family. How stable was society itself? There are four possible themes that you could look at with this question. Like with any essay, it would have to have an introduction where you set out your overall line of argument, and then maybe 4 to 5 themes. 4 is a good number, and then a conclusion where you sum up your overall argument. At the end of the day, which of the regimes was the most stable? Now, in terms of the regimes, you'll be looking at 5. So, first regime is the Kaiserreich, 1871 through to 1918, and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II on the 9th of November 1918. Second regime is the Weimar Republic, which was formed in the spring of 1919 in a series of stages when the Weimar Constitution was written, and lasted until 1933 with the rise of the Nazis. The passing of the Enabling Act on the 23rd of March 1933 effectively brought to an end the Weimar democracy. Third regime is the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1945. And then the fourth and fifth regimes are the two post-war German states with the divided Germany that were formed in 1949. So we've got the FRG, the one mentioned in the question, and the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, which is communist East Germany. So, which of these 5 regimes was the most stable and which was the most unstable? Well, the question I'm putting is, was the FRG the most unstable of those 5 regimes? Now, like with any question like this, there's no right and wrong answer as such. You could argue it several ways, and what counts is how convincing your argument is and your evidence. Now, for purposes of this video, I'm going to take one line of argument. I'm going to argue that the FRG wasn't the most unstable of the 5 regimes. Indeed, I'm going to argue it was the most stable of the 5. And I'm going to argue that the most unstable one was in fact the Weimar Republic. And that's my line of argument. And with any question like this, or with any essay like this, the first thing you've got to do is what I've just done there. Form an opinion. Have a viewpoint before you start writing. There's no point in coming to your decision halfway through writing the essay. You make your mind up before. You can obviously go back and change your mind, but you have an opinion at the very beginning. And that opinion goes in the introduction at the start. So if I was doing it with my opinion, how would I start such an essay and write such an introduction? Well, it would make some overall points about change and continuity, and then hammer in my main argument. So it might go something along the lines of this. It's certainly the case that across this period, all of the 5 German regimes had elements of instability within them, and this includes the FRGs, which did have opponents, and it gives some examples, as did the Nazis, give some examples, as did the Kaiserreich, give some examples. However, overall, the FRG is not the most unstable of these regimes, because it had a wonderful economic miracle in the 1950s where it stabilised the economy. It created a democratic system which arguably not only was still in power in 1963, but is still in power today and has become the United Germany. A very stable and long-lasting regime. The most unstable was in fact the Weimar Republic, because they had umpteen different chancellors, umpteen different coalition governments, masses of problems with the economy and political extremism, and in 1933 they were replaced by a Nazi dictatorship. Wallop. There's an introduction. Now, of course, the introduction needn't be one arguing that line of argument. It could have a completely different take on the answer. But what's important is that it has an opinion. You know, the reader of that introduction would know at the end of that first paragraph, right, Goetsche's going to argue that the most unstable regime wasn't the FRG, it's the Weimar Republic. Well, let's see if we can prove it then. And then the purpose of the rest of the essay is you proving that argument. And again, how you would lay it out is in a series of themes. You wouldn't do an essay like this regime by regime. You wouldn't do your paragraph on the Kaiserreich, your paragraph on the Weimar Republic, your paragraph on the Nazis. That would end up being description probably, what is also known as narrative. So instead of doing it like that, you would do it in terms of, let's say, political stability stroke instability, how they deal with their opponents and whether that leads to instability, economic instability, and of course social instability. There are other possible themes. Those are just 4 suggestions. Now, let's take one of those themes. Let's take economic instability. Was the FRG the most unstable of those regimes in terms of its economy? Well, it had, like any regime, periods of economic progress and boom and periods where there are a few problems. But overall, throughout the 1950s and the 1960s, there was huge economic improvement in West Germany, the FRG. You know, the so-called economic miracle, where the economy was growing due to lots of people coming in from East Germany and from other countries like Turkey to provide the cheap labour that they needed to boost industry, and various other policies were pursued which produced quite sizable economic growth without the huge slumps and problems that you got, for example, in the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. I mean, with the poor old Weimar Republic, it did have this wonderfully successful period in the middle of the 20s, known as the Golden Years or the Stresemann years, where they got economic growth improving and where, it was so good that they were able to, in 1927, introduce a very generous unemployment benefit. So there were positives in the Weimar Republic, but masses of negatives. I mean, the period from 1919 to 1923 was beset with economic problems, such as hyperinflation in 1923. But then, more crucially, the end period after 1929 saw the impact of the Great Depression on Germany, with 6 million unemployed by 1932, massive slumps in production due to the slump in international trade caused by the Depression. So the Weimar Republic was beset with major problems at the beginning and the end. Nothing like that happened in West Germany. In terms of the other regimes, well, if you look at compare West Germany to East Germany, the GDR was considered one of the most successful of the regimes of the communist bloc. But even so, compared to the West, their system was far more inadequate in producing consumer goods. So, for example, those little cars that the East Germans used to produce, the Trabants, there used to be something like a 10-year waiting list to get one. And other consumer goods dropped well behind the West, particularly in the 1970s, which I know is outside of the scope of your question. But even so, in terms of consumer good production, the East Germans lagged behind the West on the economy. So we can't really say they were the most stable economically, especially as increasingly the East Germans realised that they were, in terms of living standards, worse off than in the West. And that wasn't just in the 70s and the 80s. In the period after Stalin's death, in the 1950s, in 1953, there were riots in East Berlin because of the problems with the way the economy was working and the weekly work norms that they were being set and so on. So we can certainly say that the FRG was more stable economically than the Weimar Republic and the GDR. In terms of the Nazis, well, the Nazis had masses of problems with the economy that they had to solve when they came to power. And Hitler did have some success, getting unemployment down to 1.7 million in 1936 and virtually zero in 1938. However, much of that reduction of unemployment after 1936 during what's called the 4-year plan period was based on rearmament. And the problem with basing your economic recovery on building armaments is what do you do once you've rearmed? You know, it makes a war much more likely, especially when by the end of the 1930s these policies were starting to produce inflation. If you have a war, you can introduce a consumer of the armaments, and that's how you keep this going. So it makes war very likely, and of course war is inevitably highly unstable if that becomes a likely consequence of your economic problem, because you might lose it, and of course Hitler did lose it. With the Kaiserreich, they are having an industrial revolution at the end of the 19th century, so the economy is improving, and that to an extent there's a degree of stability there, but it's creating whole new social classes, you know, vastly increased working class or proletariat that hasn't got really much of a political voice, hence the rise of the socialists, which is opposing the policies of the Kaiser. So there is instability there. To me, with the economy, it is clear that the FRG produced the most economically stable regime, in the sense that its economic progress outdid the other 4 regimes. Now that is basically an example of how you might approach a section or a theme within that question. So, you know, you survey the other regimes, you say, well, look, a continuity as they are all grappling with economic problems. None of them are problem free. And another continuity is that there are periods where the economy is doing better at some stages than others. But there are huge changes with how they approach things. And the approach of the FRG is more successful than the approach of the Weimar Republic, and here's why. And that's showing change in continuity as well. And you can do that kind of thing with the other themes. So, for example, if you're looking at how the regimes deal with opposition, a good way of approaching that is to look at whether or not the regime is successful in minimising opposition in the first place. I would argue the FRG minimised opposition in the first place by bringing the opponents within the democratic system. So it's a democratic system where everyone can vote for the parties and MPs in the Reichstag. There are checks and balances to make sure that the system isn't abused in the FRG, so they won't let extremist parties into the Reichstag. Weimar Republic was also a democracy, didn't really have the same checks and balances to stop extremist opponents getting into the Reichstag, so they had the problem with the Nazis in there by the end of the 1920s, growing after the Depression started. So again, I would argue that the FRG beats the Weimar Republic on that. A lot of people might argue, and there's a case for this, that the dictatorships, Nazis and GDR, were better at dealing with opposition and creating more stability by clamping down on opponents using oppression. using the likes of the Gestapo in Nazi Germany and the concentration camps and the Stasi spying on people in East Germany. Now, on the surface, that looks like effective, stable dealing with opposition. However, arguably what those regimes are doing is crushing it and silencing it through oppression rather than eradicating it. The opposition is still there, and at various points, particularly when the regime looks like it might be vulnerable, that opposition can surface very quickly. So in 1944, when Hitler was losing the war, you got the July bomb plot, where a group of army officers tried to assassinate him, involving Colonel von Stauffenberg famously. With the GDR, it appeared to be very stable for 40 years. But the moment the Soviet Union withdrew its support for those regimes, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. Now that's beyond the dates of your question, but up to 1963, the GDR appears to be stable because it's supported by the military power of the Kremlin from Moscow, force, whereas the FRG stability in terms of opposition is arguably a more real, sustainable form of dealing with opposition. Bring it into the democratic system. So instead of people wanting to bring down the regime, they just want to vote for a different political party, which is of course how democracies work. So overall, again, I would argue that the FRG is the more stable regime in terms of dealing with opposition, and not the most unstable. Most unstable is, I would argue, the Weimar Republic, because of the sheer volume of opposition it has to deal with from the extreme left and then ultimately the extreme right, the wave of assassinations in 1922, but ultimately it was undermined by the problems with the economy. So, you would do the same kind of thing with the issue of political stability and the issue of social stability as well. And then at the end, a conclusion to such a question would sum up your overall line of argument. Therefore, it is the case that overall, most of the evidence supports the view the FRG was not the most unstable of the regimes. The most unstable was in fact the Weimar Republic. Reason, evidence. Mention the other three regimes, Kaiserreich, Nazis, GDR. That's how you basically approach that particular question.